The Galactic Naval Academy's Advanced Tactical Analysis classroom was exactly what you'd expect from a species that had never lost a war. Which is to say, it was absolutely gorgeous and completely impractical. Crystal walls that could shatter if you sneezed wrong, floating holographic displays that hurt your eyes if you looked at them sideways, and chairs that were apparently designed by someone who had never actually sat in one. Professor Kethvek strutted into the room on his 6 legs, all 4 arms gesticulating wildly as he began his daily ritual of reminding everyone how brilliant Zilithian military doctrine was. His purple carapace gleamed under the unnecessarily bright lighting, and his compound eyes swept across the classroom with the kind of smugness that only came from 3 centuries of easy victories against species that barely knew which end of a plasma rifle to hold. "Welcome, future admirals of the Galactic Defense Coalition," Kethvek announced, his voice carrying that particular tone that teachers use when they're about to tell you something they think is incredibly profound. "Today, we shall examine the pinnacle of naval engineering, the crown jewel of our technological superiority." The classroom was packed with the usual suspects. There was Vextar, a Krillian whose scales practically shimmered with arrogance, constantly clicking his claws against his desk in what he probably thought was an intimidating rhythm. Next to him sat Quinella, a Netherian whose 3 heads spent most of their time whispering to each other about how primitive everyone else was. The rest of the class was a mix of various species, all united by their absolute certainty that they belonged to the most advanced military force in the galaxy. And then there was Jake Morrison. The human sat in the back corner, looking about as out of place as a wrench in a jewelry store. While everyone else wore sleek, form-fitting uniforms that probably cost more than most planets' defense budgets, Jake wore standard-issue human military fatigues that looked like they'd been designed by someone whose only requirement was, make sure it doesn't fall apart when someone shoots at you. His notebook was an actual paper notebook, which had caused quite a stir on his first day, when several students had asked their translators if they were malfunctioning. Jake had arrived at the Academy 3 months ago as part of some diplomatic exchange program that nobody really understood, and most people figured was just the Galactic Council's way of being polite to the new species that had recently figured out faster-than-light travel. Humans were seen as charmingly primitive, like a pet that had learned to walk on its hind legs. Cute, but not really worth taking seriously. The other students had quickly learned to ignore Jake, which suited him just fine. He spent most classes taking notes in his primitive paper notebook while listening to lectures about the superiority of tactics he was pretty sure wouldn't work against a determined enemy with half a brain and a decent supply of explosives. "Now then," Professor Kathvog continued, his 4 arms working in perfect coordination to manipulate the holographic display, "let us begin with a question. Who can tell me what makes our warship designs so utterly superior to the crude vessels employed by less advanced civilizations?" Every hand in the class shot up except one. Jake just sat there, pen poised over his notebook, looking genuinely interested in hearing the answer. This was going to be good. Vextar's claw shot up first, naturally. The Krillian practically vibrated with eagerness to show off. "Professor, our designs represent the perfect fusion of aesthetic beauty and psychological warfare. Our enemies surrender simply upon witnessing the elegant curves of our hull plating." "Excellent point, Cadet Vextar," Kethvek beamed, which was a disturbing sight given that Zilithians had way too many teeth. The psychological impact of superior design cannot be understated. Jake scribbled something in his notebook. It looked suspiciously like he was drawing stick figures, but nobody bothered to check. Quinella's middle head spoke up, while her other 2 heads nodded in agreement with herself. "Our weapon placement follows the sacred geometry of the ancients, ensuring maximum harmony between form and function." "Sacred geometry," Jake muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the universal translator to pick up. "Right." Professor Kethvak either didn't hear or chose to ignore the comment as he manipulated the holographic display with a flourish that would have made a stage magician jealous. The image that appeared was genuinely impressive, Jake had to admit. The Coalition warship looked like someone had taken a work of art and somehow convinced it to fly through space. It was sleek, elegant, and absolutely gorgeous. Sweeping curves flowed from bow to stern like frozen music. The hull gleamed with an almost mirror-like finish that probably looked amazing in recruiting videos. Weapon emplacements were integrated so seamlessly into the design that they were barely visible, creating clean lines that were undeniably beautiful. "Behold," Kethvak announced with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies, "the Sovereign-class battlecruiser. 2 kilometers of perfection, capable of speeds that would make light itself envious. Armed with weapons that could crack a moon, and beautiful enough to make poets weep." The class murmured appreciatively. Even Jake had to nod in recognition of the craftsmanship. It really was a work of art. Notice the seamless integration of all systems, the professor continued, zooming in on various sections of the ship. No ugly protrusions, no crude armor plating disrupting the aesthetic flow. Every component serves not only its functional purpose but contributes to the overall psychological impact of the vessel. Cadet Mordak, a Thaxian whose species prided themselves on their engineering prowess, raised his hand. Professor, the energy efficiency of this design must be remarkable. All those smooth surfaces would reduce drag in subspace fields. Indeed, and the intimidation factor is incalculable, added another student. What primitive species could possibly stand against such obvious superiority? Jake's pen had stopped moving. He was staring at the holographic display with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for trying to figure out how alien food dispensers worked. His brow was slightly furrowed, like he was working through a puzzle in his head. The beauty of our approach, Kethvok continued, clearly warming to his favorite subject, is that we have evolved beyond the crude barbaric notion that warships must look like instruments of war. We have transcended the primitive mindset that equates ugly, angular designs with effectiveness. Several students glanced meaningfully toward Jake, who was still studying the hologram with that same puzzled expression. Savage species, Vexstar added with a dismissive click of his claws, still cling to the outdated concept that a warship should be built like a fortress. How wonderfully primitive. Jake looked up from his notebook for the first time since the hologram had appeared. His expression was thoughtful, almost innocent. He seemed to be considering something. Jake raised his hand. The classroom fell silent in the way that classrooms do when something unexpected happens. It wasn't that Jake never participated, exactly, but his questions usually involved things like, "Where's the bathroom?" or "Is this food supposed to move like that?" Academic discourse wasn't really his thing. Professor Kethvek blinked all 6 of his eyes in sequence, which was his species' equivalent of a double take. "Yes, Cadet Morrison?" Sorry if this is a stupid question," Jake began, and half the class immediately perked up because Jake's stupid questions were often unintentionally hilarious. "But why are there these gaps in the armor plating here, here, and here?" He pointed at several sections of the holographic ship, where the smooth hull seemed to have deliberate openings. Kethvek's expression shifted to that patient look teachers get when they're about to explain something to someone who clearly doesn't understand the sophisticated concepts at play. "Those aren't gaps, Cadet Morrison. Those are aesthetic integration points. They serve multiple purposes beyond mere protection." "Oh," Jake said, still looking confused. "What kind of purposes?" Vexstar snorted, which sounded like air being let out of a balloon. "Really, Morrison, it's called psychological warfare. The enemy sees the confidence we have in our design, the artistic statement we're making, and they understand immediately that they're facing a superior force." Plus, added Quinella's left head, while her right head rolled its eyes at having to explain something so obvious. "They provide optimal energy flow dynamics. The gaps allow for better heat dissipation and subspace field manipulation." Jake nodded slowly, like he was trying to process this information. "So those openings, they're intentional?" "Of course they're intentional," Professor Kethvak said with barely concealed exasperation. "Every aspect of coalition ship design is intentional. We don't just slap armor plates together, like some barbaric species, and hope for the best." Several students chuckled at this obvious reference to human engineering philosophy. "Right, okay," Jake said, flipping through his notebook like he was looking for something. "So, those gaps, they go right through to internal systems?" "The aliens provide access to critical components for maintenance and upgrade purposes," the professor explained in the tone of someone talking to a particularly slow child. "It's elegant engineering, Cadet Morrison. Form and function in perfect harmony." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying the hologram again. Then he asked in that same innocent tone, "What happens if someone shoots at those spots?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell. Professor Kethvik's forearms gestured dismissively. "Our defensive systems are far too advanced for such primitive tactics to be effective. Our shields, our armor composition, our tactical superiority, all combine to make such concerns irrelevant." "But if the shields failed," Jake pressed on, apparently oblivious to the growing tension in the room. "I mean, shields can fail, right? What if someone just aimed for those openings with, I don't know, a missile or something?" Vexstar let out what might have been a laugh. "Morzin, you're thinking like a barbarian. Modern warfare isn't about trading blows like some crude slugging match. It's about technological superiority, tactical elegance, psychological dominance. Besides, added Cadet Zellick, a Voltarian whose species had invented half the weapons systems on the ship. What kind of primitive mindset focuses on, what if someone shoots at us? That's assuming the enemy is even capable of getting close enough to target specific sections. Jake looked around the classroom, his expression still genuinely curious rather than challenging. So the gaps are there because you don't expect anyone to actually shoot at your ships. The silence that followed was considerably less comfortable than the previous one. Jake scratched his head, a gesture that the universal translators had given up trying to interpret months ago. "See, this is where I'm getting confused," he said, and somehow managed to make it sound like he was the problem, not the ship design that was starting to look like a very expensive piece of Swiss cheese. On Earth, we have this saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So when we build something that's supposed to fight, we kind of assume that someone's going to try really hard to break it. He gestured toward the holographic warship. Looking at this beautiful ship, I keep thinking about what my old drill sergeant would say if I showed up to a firefight wearing a uniform with deliberate holes in it. Professor Kethvek's compound eyes were beginning to twitch in a way that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Cadet Morrison, I think you're failing to grasp the sophistication of modern warfare. This isn't some primitive ground conflict with crude projectile weapons." "Oh, I get that," Jake said earnestly. "Space combat is way more complicated. That's actually why I'm confused about the gaps. Like, on Earth, when we figured out that people were going to shoot cannonballs at our ships, we started putting armor where the cannonballs were likely to hit. Especially around important stuff, like, the parts that make the ship not explode." Cadet Mordak shifted uncomfortably in his hover chair. "But Morrison, surely you understand that energy weapons operate on completely different principles than your primitive kinetic projectiles." "Sure," Jake agreed, flipping to a new page in his notebook and starting what looked suspiciously like a diagram. "Energy weapons are probably worse, right? I mean, if someone hits your power core with a plasma beam, that's going to ruin your whole day pretty much instantly." He looked up at the hologram again, squinting slightly. "And unless I'm reading this wrong, it looks like there's a pretty clear shot from this gap here, straight through to what my translator is telling me is the primary fusion reactor." The classroom had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when someone points out that the Emperor's new clothes are in fact non-existent. Jake, apparently oblivious to the growing tension, continued his analysis. "Back home, we had these things called battleships. Big, ugly, brutal-looking things. But here's the weird part. They were designed by people who assumed that other people were going to try really hard to sink them. So they put the important bits in the middle, surrounded by lots of armor, with backup systems for the backup systems." He gestured at different sections of the Coalition warship. "This ship is absolutely gorgeous, don't get me wrong. But it's like someone took all the vulnerable components and put them in exactly the places where they'd be easiest to hit." Professor Kefek's voice carried a slight edge now. "Cadet Morrison, you're operating under the assumption that our enemies would employ such crude, direct tactics. Modern warfare is about precision, elegance, technological superiority." "Right, but what if your enemy doesn't care about elegance?" Jake asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't as innocent a question as it sounded. "What if they're just really determined to make your ship stop working, and they don't particularly care about doing it prettily?" Vextar's claws were clicking against his desk much faster now. "You're describing barbarism, Morrison. Civilized species don't fight like savage animals." Jake looked genuinely puzzled by this. "But if you're fighting for your survival, or to protect your families or your planet, wouldn't you use whatever works? I mean, if someone was trying to destroy Earth, I don't think we'd worry too much about whether our tactics were elegant." He turned back to the hologram, and his voice took on a more serious tone. "Humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We've gotten pretty good at figuring out what works and what gets you killed. And one thing we learned real fast is that the side that survives is usually the one that designs their weapons and armor assuming the worst-case scenario." The silence stretched on as Jake continued to study the holographic warship. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. This ship would be absolutely devastating against an enemy that played by the same rules, fought the same way, valued the same things. But what happens when you run into someone who doesn't care about your psychological warfare, doesn't appreciate your aesthetic integration, and just wants to put holes in your ship until it stops shooting back? Every student in the classroom was staring at Jake now, but not with the usual mixture of amusement and condescension. For the first time since he'd arrived at the academy, they were listening to him like he might actually know what he was talking about. The classroom atmosphere had shifted from academic smugness to something approaching genuine discomfort. Jake seemed to notice this for the first time, and looked around with that same innocent expression that was starting to feel a lot less innocent. "Sorry, I don't mean to be difficult," he said, and several students realized they were no longer entirely convinced he was being unintentionally problematic. "It's just that humans have this weird habit of learning from our mistakes, and we've made a lot of mistakes when it comes to fighting." Professor Kethvek's forearms were now working in agitated patterns that his species used when they were trying very hard not to admit they might be wrong. "Cadet Morrison, while your species' historical conflicts may seem relevant to you, I assure you that galactic warfare operates on principles far beyond your current understanding." "Oh, absolutely," Jake agreed readily. "But here's the thing about principles. They only work until they don't." He flipped through his notebook again, and several students craned their necks to see what he'd been writing. The pages were covered with diagrams that looked suspiciously like tactical analyses. Like, take this assumption that your enemies will fight the same way you do. He looked directly at Professor Kethvek, and for the first time since he'd been at the academy, his expression wasn't apologetic or confused. What if they don't? Cadet Jelek, whose species had designed most of the weapon systems currently being discussed, spoke up with considerably less confidence than usual. "Morrison, you keep talking about these hypothetical enemies who would employ crude tactics. The civilized galaxy doesn't work that way." Jake was quiet for a moment, like he was choosing his words carefully. "You know, that's exactly what the French said about the Maginot Line." The universal translators struggled with the reference for a moment, before providing context that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "The French built the most sophisticated, most advanced, most theoretically perfect defensive system in history," Jake continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone telling a story he'd heard many times before. "It was based on all the lessons learned from the previous war, designed by the smartest military minds of their generation, and it was absolutely impregnable against the kind of attack they expected." Vextar's claw-clicking had stopped entirely. "What happened to it?" Jake's smile was not particularly comforting. "The Germans went around it?" The silence that followed was the kind that happens when an entire room full of people suddenly realizes they might have been making a very serious error in judgment. "See, that's the problem with assuming your enemy is going to be civilized," Jake said. And there was something in his voice now that suggested he'd been thinking about this for much longer than just the duration of this class. "Humans learned a long time ago that when someone is trying to kill you, they're probably not going to be polite about it." Professor Kethvek attempted to regain control of his classroom. "Cadet Morrison, you're describing scenarios that simply don't apply to modern galactic civilization. The species of the Coalition have evolved beyond such barbaric approaches to conflict." "Have they?" Jake asked, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. "Or have they just been lucky enough to only fight other species who think the same way?" He stood up, which was unusual enough to draw everyone's attention, and walked closer to the holographic display. "Professor, can you show me the battle records for Coalition forces?" Kethvek's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What kind of battle records?" "Any kind. The last 10 major engagements, maybe?" The professor manipulated the display, and a series of tactical summaries appeared. Jake studied them for several minutes while the rest of the class watched with growing unease. "Interesting," Jake said finally. "Every single one of these battles was won in the first engagement. Clean, decisive victories with minimal casualties on both sides." "Naturally," Vextar said, though he sounded less certain than usual. "Superior technology and tactics ensure swift resolution of conflicts." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Or you've never fought anyone who was desperate enough to ignore the rules." He turned to face the class, and his expression was serious in a way they'd never seen before. "What happens when you run into an enemy that doesn't care about taking casualties? What happens when they don't surrender when they see your beautiful ships? What happens when they're fighting for their homes, their families, their species' survival, and they decide that ramming one of these elegant vessels with a cargo hauler full of explosives is an acceptable trade-off?" Cadet Mordak spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "The defensive systems would prevent such crude tactics." "Would they?" Jake asked. "Your defensive systems are designed to stop sophisticated weapons fired from a respectful distance by enemies who are trying to preserve their own ships. Are they designed to stop a desperate enemy who's willing to sacrifice everything for a chance to take you with them?" Professor Kethvek had gone very still, his compound eyes fixed on Jake, with an intensity that suggested he was seeing the human student in an entirely new light. "Humans have been fighting dirty for thousands of years," Jake continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made several students realize they had never actually asked what kind of conflicts had shaped human military doctrine. We've fought when we were outnumbered, outgunned, and had no chance of winning by conventional means. We learned that survival doesn't care about your principles, your aesthetics, or your sense of civilized conduct. He gestured toward the holographic warship, and suddenly its elegant curves looked less like artistic achievement and more like a collection of structural weaknesses. This ship is absolutely perfect for fighting other ships that follow the same rules, value the same things, and fight the same way. But what happens when you run into someone like us? The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, and Professor Kethbeck looked like he was seriously considering whether early retirement might be a viable career option. His compound eyes darted between Jake and the holographic warship, and for the first time in his 3 centuries of teaching, he seemed to be at a complete loss for words. Jake, apparently realizing that he had just systematically demolished the foundational assumptions of galactic military doctrine in front of a classroom full of future admirals, looked slightly apologetic again. "I mean, I'm sure it would never come to that," he said, but the damage was already done. "Class dismissed," Professor Kethbeck announced abruptly, his forearms working frantically to shut down the holographic display. "We will continue this discussion next period." But nobody moved. Every student in the classroom was staring at Jake with expressions ranging from fascination to horror to grudging respect. The human, who had spent 3 months being treated like a friendly primitive, had just casually explained why their entire military philosophy might be a recipe for catastrophic defeat. As Professor Kethbeck hurried out of the classroom, muttering something about needing to review curriculum standards, the alien students slowly began to gather around Jake's desk. Vextar was the first to speak, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching genuine curiosity. "Morrison," he said, his claws tapping nervously against his scaled hide, "when you were analyzing our ship design, you weren't just asking random questions, were you?" Jake looked up from packing his primitive paper notebook into his equally primitive backpack. "Oh, the questions were genuine. I really didn't understand why you deliberately create weak points in your armor. I mean, I still don't, but now I understand that it's because you've never had to worry about enemies who would actually try to exploit them." Cadet Quinella's 3 heads were having what appeared to be an intense whispered conversation with each other, before her middle head spoke up. "You said humans have been fighting for thousands of years. What kind of fighting?" "Every kind," Jake replied matter-of-factly, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "We've fought with sticks and stones, swords and arrows, guns and tanks, jets and missiles. We fought on land, at sea, in the air, and now in space. We fought for territory, resources, ideology, religion, revenge, and sometimes just because we were really angry at each other." He paused, looking around at the faces of his classmates, and seemed to realize that he was describing something completely foreign to their experience. "The thing is," he continued, "humans didn't stop fighting because we got more civilized. We just got better at it. Every weapon we invented led to better armor. Every tactic we developed led to counter-tactics. Every time someone thought they'd found the perfect way to win a war, someone else figured out how to beat it." Cadet Mordak, still looking shaken, asked the question everyone was thinking. "So when you look at our ships, our tactics, our entire military doctrine, what do you see?" Jake was quiet for a moment, like he was trying to find a polite way to say something inherently impolite. Finally, he shrugged with that same casual gesture that had annoyed his instructors for months. "I see a military that's never lost a war because it's never fought anyone who was actually trying to win one." The silence that followed was deafening. "Your ships are beautiful," Jake continued, apparently deciding that diplomacy was less important than honesty. "Your weapons are incredibly advanced, your tactics are elegant and sophisticated, but they're all designed around the assumption that your enemies will play by the same rules you do." He gestured toward where the hologram had been. "That ship would be devastating in a duel between gentlemen. But war isn't a duel between gentlemen. War is what happens when civilization breaks down and people start trying to kill each other as efficiently as possible." Vextar's voice was barely above a whisper. "What would you do differently?" Jake pulled out his notebook again and flipped to a page covered with sketches. "Well, first I'd assume that everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Then I'd design redundant systems for the redundant systems. I'd put armor over anything important, and then I'd put more armor over that. I'd assume that my shields would fail at the worst possible moment, that my weapons would jam when I needed them most, and that my enemies would be smarter, more desperate, and more ruthless than I was prepared for." He showed them his sketches, which looked nothing like the elegant Coalition warship. They were angular, brutal-looking things covered in armor plating and bristling with weapons. "They're not pretty," Jake admitted, "but they're designed by people who expect to get shot at and want to live through it." As the implications of this conversation began to sink in, several students realized they would be spending the rest of their military careers wondering what other obvious flaws existed in their training, their tactics, and their fundamental understanding of warfare. Cadet Zelik, whose species had designed most of the weapon systems currently in use, asked the question that would haunt them all. Morrison, if humans are so good at fighting, and your ships are built to actually survive combat, and your tactics assume the worst-case scenario, why did you join a coalition academy instead of just building your own fleet? Jake's smile was friendly, but there was something in his eyes that reminded everyone present that humans were, according to their own admission, a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing each other. Who says we haven't? He asked cheerfully, and walked out of the classroom, leaving behind a group of future galactic military leaders who were suddenly very interested in reviewing the terms of humanity's admission to the coalition. Outside in the corridor, Jake pulled out a small communication device that looked suspiciously more advanced than anything the Academy's human cultural exchange program should have provided. Admiral Chen, he said quietly, I think we can move to Phase 2 ahead of schedule. The Academy's students are starting to ask the right questions, and their professors are going to need some time to rethink their curriculum. He paused, listening to the response, then grinned. Yes, ma'am, I think they're finally ready to learn what human military doctrine actually looks like when we're not trying to be polite about it.